Thank you. I gotta say, that's the first time I've sung a joyous song at a memorial service. And I'm quite happy with how it went. Okay. Okay, so for the next part of the service, we have a tribute by the Honourable Bob Hawke. And we're very, very glad to have you present this tribute in honour of Barry. So please come forward. Maybe someone can help bring him to the stage. Not as fit as he used to be when he was Prime Minister in this building, just a few years ago.
Ray, the Cohen boys, my dear friends one and all, I'm pleased beyond measure to be able to have this opportunity to be present today as we gather to remember and pay tribute to the Honourable Barry Cohen. And may I say, I endorse the words so brilliantly put by both our Prime Minister and our Leader of the Opposition. I didn't know Barry all that well until I went into Parliament in October 1980. But, you know, naturally we ran into one another at ALP conferences prior to then. As the member for Robertson, since 1969, he was already a well-established and respected member of the Labor caucus. When the Australian Labor Party won government in 1983, I was extremely fortunate that the parliamentary party elected a highly talented ministry, which, while in opposition, had set the framework for much of what was to follow in the early years of my government. Barry had served on House committees covering road safety, foreign affairs, environment, conservation, as well as being a member of parliamentary delegations to all corners of the globe. Excuse me. Within the party itself, he had been the Shadow Minister for the Environment, Sport, Recreation, Tourism and Home Affairs for a period of time. The Ministry of Home Affairs and the Environment included some of Barry's personal interests, the environment and the arts. So he was a natural fit for that portfolio. On the very first parliamentary sitting day of my government, following the Governor-General's opening speech, Barry introduced the World Heritage Property Conservation Bill 1983, directly relating to the protection of the Southwest Tasmanian World Heritage Area, strengthening our commitment to stopping the construction of the Gordon Below Franklin Dam in Tasmania. Barry had visited this beautiful, majestic area and knew precisely what was at stake, not from being told by bureaucrats, but from his own committed personal observation. And he also put the case that Tasmania's unique wilderness areas would one day be at the forefront of economic growth in that state and prosperity for Tasmania. And 35 years later, my friend, the figures vindicate completely Barry's pursuance on behalf of the government of what we all knew to be right. But the southwest of Tasmania was not the only enduring legacy of his 4 years as Minister for the Environment. He oversaw the protection of the Great Barrier Reef, Uluru, and he ensured extended areas of the Kakadu National Park received World Heritage listing. As Minister, championing vulnerable areas of outstanding beauty led to Australia becoming a world leader in implementing the World Heritage Convention. As Minister for the Arts, Barry was responsible for the establishment of the National Film and Sound Archives and Questacon. His portfolio responsibilities were wide-ranging, including the National Library, National War Memorial, National Archives, even shipwrecks, as well as the Australia Council, for which he achieved substantially increased funding. His pervasiveness had me appointing Gough Whitlam as chairman of the National Art Gallery. We should always remember too that his business acumen was also a great asset in the administration of his portfolios. When negotiating with the Irish government as Minister assisting me on the bicentennial matters, he suggested a suitable gift would be the digitalisation of the records of Irish convicts sent to Australia. Barry was an outstanding and well-respected local member for the seat of Robertson for 22 years, 4 of which he served as a minister. Having won 8 successive elections, he was generous in sharing his time campaigning and in assisting other members in their electorates. He continued his involvement with the party, of course, well after his retirement. Throughout his parliamentary career, although taking the job seriously, he never took himself seriously, as we all know and remember him so lovingly. He was funny, he was witty, he was quick with the repartee. I recall one day he brought to my office a friend of his, the British actor Paul Eddington of Yes Minister, Yes Prime Minister fame. And naturally there was much hilarity with competing proprietorial claims on the chair. However, I can assure you what wasn't hilarious was his taking my money consistently on the golf course. I should have known better than to take on a challenge with someone who once dreamed of being a professional golfer. And if you look at the picture on the back of our program, you can see the stance is that of a professional. Following Barry's parliamentary career, he and his wife Ray established a wildlife sanctuary on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. As an author, his keen, perceptive observation of people stood him in good stead, enabling him to produce many books about his and others' experience as a parliamentarian. Gough, it seemed, was a bottomless resource. My friends, Barry's commitment to our nation will be forever on the parliamentary record, and he will be remembered through a number of important and vital policies for which he had ministerial responsibilities. The Australian Labor Party thanks him for his service, and Ray and boys, your family has very much to be proud of in the marvellous contribution that Barry made to the Australian nation. Thank you very much. Our thoughts are with you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawke. It's great to see that, in your senior years, you still have it and still speak so beautifully. I got to say that one of my earliest memories as a young, small child was in 1988 outside the then brand new Parliament House. My father, was a rabbi in Sydney, organised a lighting of a great menorah, Chanukiah, and you gave a speech there. You helped light the menorah. I still remember parts of that speech. It was one of my earliest memories, but my father, who was close with Barry, told me how proud Barry was of that historic day. And so wishing you lots of continued only good health for many years to come. We move forward in the program, and I'm honoured to have here Michael Danby, MP, who I'm sure will tell you how he worked for Barry for many years, and Barry was his mentor. And I'd like to thank Michael. Do I see you here, Michael? Oh, there. I'd like to thank Michael for introducing me to Barry a few years ago, and some of the lessons I learned from Barry late in life, even as he wasn't 100% healthy, are lessons that will stay with me forever. And it's some of these lessons I speak about quite often. So, Michael Danby, thank you for that, and thank you for all that you've done for Barry and organising and helping to organise all of this. It gives me an honour to call you to the stage.
Prime Ministers, Speaker, Leader of the Opposition, Ray and the Cohen boys, as Prime Minister Hawke described you. All of us work for Barry Cohen, even when we're not employed by him. When I was elected to Parliament, it made no difference. He still thought I worked for him and just needed to implement his million bright ideas. Barry was, in the full Australian vernacular meaning of the word, a character. He was the first sports commentator for Sydney's TCN9. He was the first boss to join the Shop Assistants Union. Even the legendary Jono Johnson was taken aback by Barry's interest in Labor when Barry was running his beloved fashion store in St Ives Fashion Plate. Many years later, as Prime Minister Hawke recounted, he turned the Central Coast seat of Robertson into an absolute Labor bastion, holding it from 1969 to 1990. He was the last opposition male to hold the position of spokesperson on women's affairs, as in 1978 there were no women in the House of Representatives at all. Barry was elected 9 times between 1969 and 1990. There'll be few who can replicate that. I see Philip Ruddock in the audience, perhaps he can. But as Martin Luther King said, political longevity has its place. Barry's passions for the arts, heritage and environment were fulfilled, as Prime Minister Hawke said when he became Minister for those portfolios. His passion for Kakadu in particular, I believe, established it in the public imagination alongside other Indigenous icons such as Uluru and the Kimberleys. He was a visionary in road safety from the 1970s, demanding vehicles have airbags, something we all take for granted now but was very forward-thinking in those days. He was the Environment Minister who forbade the mining of mineral sands on Fraser Island. He was one of the Hawke government's spearheads in preserving the natural wonders of the Franklin in Tasmania. But successful life in business and in politics was not enough for him. He was the author of 9 books between 1987 and 2011 and an immense collection of newspaper and magazine columns, which I've spent the last week reading. Again, I might say, I read them mostly the first time. Some of his columns were excoriating about topics as varied as the wit and wisdom of the New South Wales right, the perils of nouvelle cuisine, the superannuation industry, where he argued that government should, quote, save seniors from racetrack touts posing as fund managers. Cohen made unpopular forays in his immense newspaper output, arguing that ministerial travel ought to be judged on its outcome, not on its cost, that backbenchers should resume their independence and resume their rights at question time. He was a devoted ally and admirer of Senator John Faulkner and his plans to clean up Labor. Barry's whiplash pen critiqued people on his own sides, from Peter Garrett to Graham Richardson, and most memorably, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. In the early 1990s, years before Rudd became a national figure, Cohen gave him a character evaluation that, reading it 20 years later, through all that happened in the intervening years, makes Barry sound like the Oracle of Bungendore. But big brave Barry didn't simply snipe from the safety of his newspaper columns. He was a fierce critic of the maladministration of the Interparliamentary Union and attended his last gathering of that august organisation, where he was subject to a 2-hour harangue from Fidel Castro. With incredible courage, next day, he gave it back, both barrels, to the Cuban dictator, and he left Havana alive. Barry's gentlest side was shown in his passion for the Indigenous people of this country. This began with his super involvement prior to politics as the non-Indigenous assistant to the Aboriginal campaign for the successful 1967 referendum. And you can see that years later when you read his tribute to his mentor and Indigenous friend Faith Bandler on her death, probably one of the most memorable newspaper columns I've ever read. If all of that wasn't enough for Barry, he was the deputy chair of this old Parliament House and successfully participated in its transition to the Museum of Democracy that it is now. Cohen, throughout his parliamentary career and newspaper life, shared with me an immense pride in his Jewish origins and was a subtle and informed advocate of Israel. The weight of the Nazi genocide of millions, including large segments of his family, weighed very heavily on the shoulders of his memory. Ray and he did great justice to his murdered relatives, visiting Poland and writing a searing account of the fate of the Kozivoda family in an article that you can get from the National Archives, but was published in the Bulletin. It's probably easy to get it from my office. I do urge you to read it. Lastly, let me deal with the difficult topic of Barry's last years. His courage in dealing with his dementia, mentioned by all of our leaders, was matched only by Adam and Ray's devotion to his increasing physical fragility. He even turned his suffering into a good story. When I got word, Barry said, when word got out that I had joined the list of dementia sufferers, one of the first calls I got was from an old friend. Mr. Howard's calling, was the message from the nurse. I don't know a Mr. Howard, unless it's a former Prime Minister. That's the one, replied the nurse. Now, I'm proud that a few months before his death, his Praetorian Guard, his old ministerial staff, led by Dr. Sergio Sergi, Peter Conway, myself and Adam, made our last visit to bid him farewell, the nursing home in Goulburn. It was very difficult. I'm so glad we did it. He recognised all of us. He was obviously fading. It was very emotional. He cried. It was wonderful that we had a chance to say goodbye. Barry Cohen, big Australian, big character. His memory is a blessing.
Thank you so much, Michael. I want to wish you also many, many more years of community work in good health and free from distractions to continue doing the great work that you do. It's now time for a eulogy. And whilst we've heard lots of beautiful tributes, I think it's fitting that the eulogy comes from one of Barry's sons. So we have here today Adam, Stuart and Martin, and from the boys, Stuart will be representing the family in giving Barry's eulogy.
My dad was a funny bastard. He once said to Mum, not that long ago actually, it's a shame you can't go to your own funeral. And I know what he meant. He just wanted to hear all the wonderful things that were said about him. And thank you. I'm sure he would have been delighted. The very first time I came to Old Parliament House was almost 5 decades ago. I was 9 years old. I came here by car with Mum and Dad, along with my grandfather Lou Cohen and my granduncle Joe Cohen. We undertook what then seemed to a 9-year-old an epic journey from Sydney along a narrow 2-lane highway, across the Razorback, past the Anthony Horden's tree, and along the bumpy road that skirted the shore of Lake George. We eventually arrived here in Canberra, and I played on a treeless Capitol Hill and stayed at the Currajong Hotel long before it became fancy. My room had a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling and an old enamel wash basin in the corner. I remember this. It was a different time. Dad had just been elected to the House of Representatives as the new Labor MP for the Central Coast of Robertson, after stealing it from the Liberals who'd held it for 20 long Conservative years. I remember how hard both my parents had worked to win the seat. My family owned a new blue 1968 Valiant, which did a weekly pilgrimage up and down the winding Pacific Highway. Weekend after weekend with my 2 brothers, occasionally the family dog and the cat in the back. I recall very clearly Dad laying out the maps of the electorate on his bed, marking off house by house each home in each suburb he and Mum had door-knocked together. Places like Woy Woy, Ettalong and Umina Beaches. Thousands of homes over months and months of snarling cats and dogs and surly pensioners, swooping magpies, flower shows, scout hall meetings and senior citizens gatherings. Together, my parents burnt the boot leather on the footpaths and tracks that was the Central Coast back then. On Saturday night, October 25, 1969, we waited with the hundreds of volunteers and party faithful for the result. We watched the ABC election coverage on a black and white television with rabbit ears for antennae. At some point later in the evening, after calculating the figures coming in from the booths, it was announced in Laurie and Win O'Malley's home near Gosford that Barry had indeed done the unthinkable and won. 4 months later, March 5, 1970, we were inside this building to watch my father give his maiden speech in the House of Reps. I do remember him actually giving it, but I'd remembered absolutely nothing about what he said at the time. As a 9-year-old, I just remember it being a very important moment. Important for Dad, important for me. I read that speech intently for the first time only 2 weeks ago. And what surprised me most about his maiden speech is that after all that effort, after all the snarling dogs, meetings, footpaths and scout halls, it was clear that the most important issue for him on that one day, in that one moment, before the elected representatives of Australia's Parliament, was the treatment of Australia's Indigenous peoples and the appalling conditions under which so many of them lived. He devoted 3/4 of his maiden speech to this one subject. He was 34 years old, a shopkeeper, married to Ray with 3 little boys under 9. He was ordinary, but his message was not. This message guided him. What's wrong? What's unfair? How do we make it right? Of all of his achievements, though, the one I think I'm most proud of is that 2 years previously, Dad, the owner-manager of a menswear store in St Ives, politically inexperienced and certainly no activist up until then, took on a role as what I believe today to be an assistant campaign director for the Yes campaign under the great late Faith Bandler in 1967. Auntie Faith and her Dutch husband Hans were such regular visitors to our home at the time that my 4-year-old brother Martin took to referring to them as Face and Hands. There was no financial reward for him, his efforts were free, his heart was well placed, the rest is history. Of this I'm most proud. My father was a complex man in so many ways, full of contradictions, imperfect and magnanimously generous. Affectionate and sometimes tactless, unsaintly and irreligious, but a devout cultural Jew, deeply conscious and proud of his heritage. His grandfather Moshe, it is said, escaped to England from his Polish village in the bottom of a fruit cart to avoid becoming cannon fodder for the Cossacks during a time that was very bleak for Jews across Eastern Europe. Moshe saw the writing on the wall and made his way to Australia, and with my great-grandmother Zelda, established a family and a presence in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Those family that remained were wiped out by the Nazis, a fact my father felt to his core. This was among some of the family history my father tried to explain at my daughter Elia's bat mitzvah some years ago. But he was so overcome with emotion, wiping tears from his eyes, he had to sit down. It was the only time I ever saw my father incapable of finishing a speech. Such was the power and influence of his Jewish heritage over his life and his future, and what underpinned his unwavering support for the State of Israel. My father was a big presence wherever he went, and he lived a big life across every one of his 82 years. He once said to me when I was a teenager, "I've never been bored." An astounding proposition for a teenager on the Central Coast around 1975. But he wasn't joking. His mind was constantly at work pondering social issues and problems and conjuring solutions. When he read in the papers about the little bloke getting a raw deal, he was instantly outraged and would sit at the breakfast table yelling about how unfair something was. And I said to him once, "Dad, why are you shouting at us?" He was momentarily puzzled by the question, then came, "Because I'm just passionate." And that he was. Barry Cohen, my dad, was a passionate man in just about everything and anything he pursued. Nothing by half measure, nothing left undone. He never took a step back. He was a front and centre guy, and you knew when he'd arrived. I recall very clearly a moment when I was about 12 years old, and the tumultuous 1972 It's Time campaign was just ahead. And we were all being propelled by the prospect of major political change. As we were driving through Gosford, he said to me, "I'd be very disappointed one day if you don't find a way to serve your community." This is who he was. This was one of the many values he passed on. Serving the community was a driving force in Dad's life. He did not enter politics just because he thought it a good career option. He wasn't a lawyer, a party hack or a union rep. He came from a time when more ordinary folk offered themselves for election to contribute. I believe completely he entered Parliament because he felt he had something good of himself to give to the country, and that's what he did, not just in Parliament. Can I have some water? Thank you, sorry. Being a son of Barry Cohen had its challenges. As a very hard-working local MP, he was recognised everywhere he went on the Central Coast, and I mean everywhere. To a large degree, I and my two brothers, Martin and Adam, lost our anonymity the day he became an MP. Everyone everywhere seemed to know we were Barry's sons, a not altogether comfortable feeling for a teenage boy, I can tell you. There were many times in my life when I'd wished I'd had one of those ordinary dads as a father. Someone who took us fishing or kicked the footy around the backyard. That's not to say he didn't, but these moments were more the exception than the norm. But being a son of Barry's also opened us up to a world that to me now almost seems surreal when I look back at the memories and experiences I had with him. The famous Indigenous poet, Kath Walker, later known as Oodgaroo Noonuckle, lived with us for a time. Vincent Lingari's brother Walter also came to stay. Mary Travers of Peter, Paul and Mary fame stayed after Dad wrote to them for help in promoting the '67 referendum, which they did. I'd often answer the phone at home, and there were many occasions when I'd say, "Dad, it's for you, it's Goth." Or it would be Bill, Bob or Paul, or any number of Labor legends. I shook hands with the King and Queen of Spain, dined with Moshe Dayan in his backyard, lunched with the leader of the Zulus, Mangasutu Buthelezi. Imagine sitting at the family table listening to Tom Keneally telling stories, or lounging in the backyard with Jack Thompson. It was just like that, and it seems sort of strange now, but it was our normal. In 1983, after just becoming a minister, Dad's at Sydney Airport and spots Paul Eddington, the star of the TV series Yes Minister. It was Dad's all-time favourite comedy, And as always, never ever shy, my father bowls up to Paul and says, "We've got a lot in common. I've just become a minister." And that was the beginning of a lifelong friendship. Being a son of Barry's was always interesting and rarely dull. It's been said by someone somewhere before, and rightly so, that there's always a great woman behind a great man. I'm sure it works both ways, but in this case, that woman is my mother, Ray. Of tough as nails, Irish-Scots ancestry, and proud of it, as I am, Dad would have struggled to achieve what he did in life without her persistence, patience, forbearance, and loyal love. In his final 2 years